As an airline passenger, you always assume that the pilots of your aircraft are taking safe decisions based on industry best practices, as well as their own experience. But what happens if those two things start working against each other? Stay tuned in the evening of December 31st, 2020. An Air France crew was getting ready to operate Flight 736 back from Brazzaville, in the Republic of Congo, to Chalal Airport in Paris. They had spent their layover in Congo and was now eager to get back home, especially since it was New Year's Eve, but also because the conditions in Congo were still a bit complicated in regards to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and also due to widespread violence in parts of the country which had led to several countries actually imposing travel restrictions. This fact was likely in the back of the pilots' minds. As they were going through their planning documents before the flight, they had several alternates available to them along the route, but would definitely prefer not to use them. The good news, though, was that the weather both at their departure airport along the route and at their destination looked fine for this time of year, and as they were looking through the NAUTPs, as the documents provided to highlight on deficiencies in airports they might use, these looked reasonably good, as well, there were, as always, some minor points highlighted, but those were mainly focused on the en route alternates, and as I mentioned, the pilots had no intentions of visiting one of them, if they could avoid it. The flight time was planned to be quite long on this flight, so the flight crew had also been augmented with an extra pilot to enable some in-flight rest for them along the way. So once the pre-flight planning was completed, the three pilots decided on a final fuel of 45.5 tons, and then headed over to their cabin crew colleagues to brief them about the flight. Like I mentioned before, this flight took place during the pandemic, so there were only 136 passengers booked, and that likely meant that the 8 cabin crew were expecting a quite relaxed flight home towards Paris. And it is also worth mentioning here that among those passengers, there were 2 Air France maintenance technicians traveling home for the holidays anyway, since there was no significant weather expected along the route and nothing else out of the ordinary. The pilots soon finished their cabin crew briefing, and together they all started proceeding out toward the aircraft. The captain was a very experienced 54-year-old with close to 12,400 hours of total time logged. He had started his career in the military before joining Air France in 2002, and he had then gotten his command on the Boeing 737 flying for Air France's subsidiary Transavia, where he stayed for about 4 years before finally being transferred back to mainland, France again. And he had started flying the Airbus A330 as a captain only about 8 months before this flight. This meant that although he had over 3,800 hours of total experience, on that type only 80 of those had been operated as a captain. The 2 first officers that he was going to fly with had very similar experience as the 15 captain. Both of them had started off in the military, and the one who was going to start off in the right seat on this flight was 53 years old and had a total experience of 5,656 hours. This meant that he was pretty experienced overall, but only 550 of those hours had been flown on the Airbus A330. The relief pilot was 54 years old and had 4,800 hours in total. He was slightly more experienced on the Airbus A330 with 83 hours, but on top of that, he had also worked as a synthetic flight instructor or a simulator instructor on 000350, that same type for Airbus. But in any case, the absolutely most experienced on board was the senior Purer, who was 57 years old and had amassed a staggering 16,400 hours across several different types, and her experience will soon become very apparent. As the crew walked out toward the gate, they could soon see their shiny Airbus A330 gleaming in the apron lights waiting for them with all sorts of catering baggage and fueling activity going on around it. It was 18 years old at the time of this flight, and it had 000425 recently gone through some heavy maintenance over in China, where, among other things, the NI had been removed and subsequently refitted again now, for this to make any kind of sense to you. And before we continue, it's important to explain a few things here about the Airbus A330 fuel system in general, and this engine refitting procedure in particular. You see, the fuel system on the Airbus A330 is quite complex. It is made up by 2 tanks in each wing, plus a center fuel tank in the belly between the wings, and something known as a trim tank in the AA horizontal stabilizer inside of the inner tanks. On each wing, there are so-called collector cells from where the fuel is drawn down through the main fuel hoses in the pylons and